Hello and welcome to the Medicine and Science podcast from the BMJ. I'm Elizabeth Mahays, standing in for Cameron Abbasi this week. We have two very different stories from the world of medicine. Firstly, the assisted dying bill has just passed through its second debate in the House of Lords. I spoke to the Labour MP who's sponsoring the bill, Kim Leadbeater. And maybe the old phrase, correlation does not equal causation, isn't so simple after all. The BMJ's Duncan Jarvies spoke to the authors of some new research on how far exactly we can infer causes from observational data alone. Firstly, the assisted dying bill has passed its second reading in the UK's House of Lords, and will now go through another committee stage to finalise what has been a very contentious piece of legislation. Questions still remain around safeguarding, the role of doctors, and the financing of the actual service that will help people end their lives. In the days leading up to the bill's second hearing in the House of Lords, I went to Parliament to talk to Kim Leadbeater, the MP who proposed the bill in the first place, to ask her about some of these key issues.
I'm Kim Leadbeater, the Member of Parliament for Spen Valley in West Yorkshire, and I am the sponsor of the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill.
And did you watch the debate on Friday? So it was the first half of the Lords debate.
I was here in the Lords all day, other than toilet breaks and sandwich break. I watched the entire debate last week.
What did you think of it?
I thought it was really powerful. The debates in the Commons have been extremely powerful, respectful, civilised. For the main part, there have been some exceptions, sadly, but generally speaking, people have treated each other in a very civilised manner, irrespective of the different views there are on this subject. And I thought that was also the case in the Lords on Friday. And I think, we have people in different categories on this issue. There are people who are very passionate about changing the law, often because of their own personal experience. We have people who are fundamentally opposed to changing the law, and we saw both sides of that debate on Friday. And we also saw people probably somewhere in the middle, many of whom think that there are problems with things as they stand, but just want to make sure that we get this right, as everybody does, including myself, of course. So it was interesting to hear those different perspectives.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of comments that were made on Friday, particularly around the kind of fears of the way that this could be abused. I think that's the kind of main, aside from maybe religious reason, that's the main kind of one that we're seeing a lot of. And Theresa May specifically said, she called it a license to kill, and she said that it effectively says suicide is okay, and she raised some concerns about how it could make vulnerable people feel that they're kind of under pressure to end their lives. I wanted to ask you a bit about, do you understand where people are coming from with that? And also if you have a response to those kind of fears.
Yeah, I've always been really respectful of different views on this issue, and I understand the nervousness, I understand the concern about such a big change, and it is a big change. Although we are not trailblazers, as I've said, on this issue, lots of other countries have been offering this choice to dying people in a very compassionate and very safe way for quite some time now. And there were a number of comments made on Friday, which I disagree with, but I think one thing that we've got to get better at in this country is disagreeing well. And I do think somebody like Theresa May, who I've got a huge amount of respect for, and she's actually very kind to me when I got elected, and we've had lots of conversations about lots of other things where we actually agree. But she is fundamentally opposed to a change in the law, and that puts her in a very different position to me, as with some other colleagues as well. I think the language around suicide is a very delicate discussion to have. Certainly the terminally ill people I have met would never describe themselves as suicidal. They do not want to die. Now, I also understand people who are suicidal often do not want to die. But so it's a complex area of discussion and debate, and it's something that I think we need to explore and unpick. But I'm quite defensive about it because of those conversations I've had with terminally ill people. They want to live, but they are dying. And therefore that choice has been taken away from them. And actually one of the only things that they can choose and take control over is how they die and when they die, to some degree. So I think almost saying, we're giving a license to kill, it's not about that framing of it, I find is a bit insensitive, if I'm honest. I think it's about that person having the choice, having the autonomy, having the dignity in their dying days that I think we should be able to offer them. In terms of a system that could be abused, look, two really important points on that. One, we have very few safeguards now in terms of what happens at the end of people's lives. So we have people, as I've said, who are taking their own lives out of desperation and fear. We have people who are going to other countries for an assisted death with very little legal regulation around that. We then have prosecutions of families and loved ones, because the police have got to do their job. And this is the fundamental legal failing that we have. And we've got 5 former directors of public prosecutions who have said, we have these cases on our desk where we have a duty to have some sort of investigation. So there's that situation at the moment, which is very unsafeguarded, I would suggest. And what the bill does, it puts a very robust legal framework around a very thorough process. And the other criticism, that the bill has had, and we had a little bit of this on Friday as well, has been it's actually too difficult. And I have had terminally ill people contact me and said, goodness me, Kim, we've got a few months left to live and you're making us jump through all these different hoops. Now, I find that a bit uncomfortable, but I also don't really apologise for it, because I would rather have a very robust process that, is foolproof and means that only someone who really wants to make this choice would make this choice, then have a very quick process where it would potentially be open to abuse. So I am very confident in the safeguards within the bill. But equally, if the Lords have got further ideas to refine the legislation, I've always been very open-minded to that as well.
West Routing has said there's no budget for an assisted dying service. What's your response to that? And do you think that there is a way that this can be rolled out?
Yeah, one thing I did struggle with a little bit at committee stage in the Commons was extending the implementation period from 2 years to 4 years. But I've reflected on that quite a lot, and I think actually it's very important that we get this right. It's very important that we get the structures in place to facilitate this choice for people. So I would rather do it well than do it quickly. That gives us 4 years. Now, did we come into government with a budget for assisted dying and this bill? No, we didn't. But actually, if the law is passed, which I hope it will be, and I've got no reason to believe it won't be, then government will make this work. The other thing I would say is there are costs involved in setting it up, and there was a very thorough impact assessment done by the government, but there are also savings as well. What I've tried not to do is distill an issue of such significance and emotional importance to pounds and pence and money, because that doesn't feel right. But I also understand we do have to accept that there is a financial side to it. These are not new patients. These are patients who are already in the system by very virtue of the fact that they have a terminal illness. So yes, there will be the infrastructure that needs to be put in place to give people this choice, but we are not suddenly going to have lots of new patients coming forward to access assisted dying because they're already being treated. So I think we need to, yes, be aware of cost savings around the process, but actually we also need to keep a very patient-centred, person-centred approach to this, I think.
There are still issues to work out around assisted dying. Just before the hearing last week, the BMJ hosted a parliamentary roundtable to hear the concerns of palliative care doctors and psychiatrists. 2 of those, Jamila Hussain, a palliative care consultant in Bradford, and Gareth Owen, a psychiatrist in London, spoke to us about what they think is left to be worked out in the bill. Firstly, here's Jamila.
My name's Jamila Hussain. I'm a palliative care consultant working in inner city Bradford in Yorkshire. I'm also an academic focusing on inequalities at the end of life. So I firstly did a consultation with racialised communities living in disadvantaged areas in Bradford. I also spoke to 24 victims of domestic abuse and also parents of young people aged 18 to 25 who are autistic or have a learning disability, as to get their views on how we could make the bill safer for them. One of the main things that came from the consultation with racialised groups was, firstly, there was a diversity of views about the principle of assisted dying. And, I'd spoken to Pakistani community, Bangladeshi, Black African, Black Caribbean, Roma communities. They all said the same thing. The main thing they were worried about is this is going to be something that's disproportionately going to affect their community, especially post-COVID, where the stats really bear out that those communities suffered much more. And, they pointed to the cemetery down the road to say, you just walk down there, Jamal, and you will see what happened to our community. And what they made clear to me was that they'd also, because of this, be scared about accessing palliative care services, but also acute hospital services, because they were so worried that the same thing would happen, that these people would come into hospital and assisted dying would be a way of disproportionately impacting them. And it's important to know that I was really careful in making sure they understood their safeguards. They understood that that isn't possible. You can't just go into hospital and a doctor decides that assisted dying could happen. But because of this fear, especially post-COVID, that is how people are thinking about this. And any person who's listening to this podcast who comes from those communities like I do know that this misinformation is already increasing. What worries me, though, is that within the bill, there is the potential to make sure that there are public health approaches. So we go out and proactively ensure misinformation is addressed, ensure that we build trust with these communities, and we ensure that they get access to the palliative care we already know they don't access as equitably as other groups. But when I've been speaking to legislators and parliamentarians, what I often find is when I make this point that it's really important that we address this misinformation is they will reframe this as an issue about equity, that the issue for racialized communities is they do not have equitable access to assisted dying. Now, I am not against assisted dying in principle, and I've always advocated for equitable access, that this shouldn't be something that people have to pay for, that anyone should be able to access it if this is their wish. But if we do not understand the context of UK and health and social care, the fact that racialised communities have poorer access to housing, poorer access to good education and employment, poorer access to health and social care from the moment they're born right to the end of life, there's deep-seated inequalities, that if we then disproportionately target these groups for education or what some people would see as promotion of assisted dying, that is deeply problematic. So the key thing is public health approaches to education about what is assisted dying and how is it different to palliative care? How is it different to other health and social care? So we don't worsen these already embedded inequalities. The main thing that parents of the young people said was that they have had to fight, and we see this in our practice, don't we, that you will have, I see this in palliative care, I'm an adult palliative care physician, that you'll have people with autism and learning disability and their elderly frail parent will be by their side still advocating for them as an adult, because again, our health and social care system hasn't been able to embed adjustments and support that's needed, that those parents aren't needed to advocate for their child. And the key thing that they came to focus on was the importance of family advocacy. So at the moment in the bill, in terms of family involvement, because this is framed around autonomy, which I don't disagree with, is that it would be up to the person to tell their family. And only if the doctor felt it was appropriate, the assessing doctor, that they would ask the person whether they had told their family and perhaps support them to inform their family. Now, there's a huge danger in that for people who are autistic and those with learning disability, that the parents made really clear that actually, their cognitive processing is different, their communications is different, the way that they interact socially. A key thing was masking the fact that they will not want to, they'll be so scared of advocating for themselves and will want to please the healthcare professional who might be assessing them for this. So there's real dangers for this group by not including family. But again, I have been raising this since January, and what I hear back is that this is an issue of autonomy, that this is adding unnecessary bureaucracy and we're curtailing the autonomy of some groups. But it's really important for us to understand from an inequalities perspective, what is bureaucracy for one person is an essential safeguard for another person. And at the moment, I don't think the bill adequately addresses these young people with autism and learning disability. When I spoke to the victims of domestic abuse, what they impressed on me is, firstly, domestic abuse goes up towards the end of life because the woman can no longer physically keep herself safe. So if there's a certain level of expectations around cleaning and chores, etc., she can't physically do that. So she's more vulnerable. But also importantly, her ability to disclose is much harder because she's physically more dependent on that person, but also the risks to her and her ability to keep herself safe is reduced. What they said was actually the biggest risk, and they didn't really even frame it as a risk, was that the woman would choose assisted dying as her way out because she knows the abuse is going to go up because she knows she can't keep herself safe, because she doesn't trust that health and social care services will be able to keep her safe and give her safe housing, give her financial support that she would need. Assisted dying was probably the best option that she could take. And that really bears out in national statistics that the largest cause of death due to domestic abuse now in the UK is suicide. So this isn't a theoretical risk, it's a real risk.
And that was Jamila Hussain talking about vulnerable groups in this legislation. Now, over to Gareth Owen.
Hello, my name's Gareth Owen. I'm a Professor of Psychological Medicine, Ethics and Law at King's College London, and work there as part of the Complex Life and Death Decisions Research Group. The bill makes it clear that the process starts with a preliminary discussion. That preliminary discussion, I think, is very important to think about in terms of it being a normal sort of health and social care discussion, actually about ordinary health and social care matters, and most importantly about, in this context of terminal illness, about palliative care. What you don't want is a situation where people are going into thinking about assisted dying because they haven't been able to have the opportunities to think through just ordinary palliative care type matters. So we think in the Complex Life and Death Decision Group that this preliminary discussion really needs to have a palliative care assessment baked in. In fact, we actually think it's a requirement of the process, not because people need to necessarily accept everything that's being offered in that palliative care context, but just to sort of enable that people have the access equitably when we know it can be so important. But of course, after that, what the bill is doing is going through a process of assessments for eligibility. So there are assessments of the capacity of somebody to make a decision to end their own life. There are assessments that somebody is, in fact, got a 6-month life expectancy in the context of terminal illness, and assessments of absence of coercion or pressure. Now, those assessments are not inherently medical assessments. I think that's very important to get across. So when doctors are involved, they're doing something that's not a conventional medical role, because the consent processes here are not conventional consent processes for treatment. I mean, assisted dying is not inherently a treatment. It's a decision that's a personal choice. It's a decision of a very existential, personal kind about ending one's own life. And the other thing, of course, about these assessments and the consent processes that they involve is the doctor is not making a recommendation. Of course, the doctor is not recommending to somebody that they seek an assisted death. That would be quite odd to think and concerning, in fact, to think that a doctor was doing that. Whereas, of course, in a treatment context, that's what you ordinarily would expect. A doctor would be making a recommendation. So doctors in this role are taking on very unconventional role, not conventional medical roles. They're not inherently medical roles at all, I would argue, although medical expertise is going to be important to bring to bear on these assessments. And then the other thing that's very important to understand, of course, about the consent processes here is that they're driven by the patient. The whole overarching idea here is around patient autonomy. So the patient is making a request to end their own life. And then the question for these assessment steps is eligibility. That's the primary matter. So I think it is going to be very important in the committee stages now in the Lords, given that it goes through to this select committee, that the bill makes it clearer that the importance of the preliminary discussion, that this is a palliative care assessment that is offered, and that if the patient wishes to proceed, the assessments that follow are in an important sense demedicalized, actually. Importantly, they're not treatment matters. They're not assessments of treatment that's being recommended by any doctor. They're non- or demedicalized assessments of eligibility.
Next, we've been taught that you can't establish a causal relationship from observational data. But if you've been reading the BMJ's research recently, you may have noticed that we're publishing more articles that do just that. This novel methodology is called Target Trial Emulation, and Duncan Jarvies, our producer, talked to some of our research team about how it works.
Hi, I'm Tobias Kurt. I'm a professor of public health and epidemiology at the Charité Universitätsmedizin in Berlin, Germany. I'm also an adjunct professor of epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in Boston, Massachusetts.
And Tobias, you also helped the BMJ with our research evaluation.
That's true. So I'm a consultant method editor for the BMJ and the BMJ Open.
Great. Jeremy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jeremy Lebrecht. I'm assistant professor of epidemiology at Erasmus MC in Rotterdam in the Netherlands.
And you are the author of an upcoming research methods and reporting about the language around causal inference that we'll be publishing soon. Tim.
I'm Tim Feeney. I'm a research editor at the BMJ. I'm a clinical editor at BMJ Medicine. I'm a researcher at UNC Chapel Hill. And my area of focus is clinical epidemiology and epidemiologic methods.
I have a rule of thumb that I've always had that you can't make causal inference from observational data. Now, over time, being at the BMJ, that's been challenged. Mendelian randomization came along and I had to learn about that. But this is yet another kind of step away from there. Maybe, Tobias, if I can start with you, can you take us through a little bit of this history? How have we gone from saying, no, you can't make a causal inference to where we are now?
For many years, also in epidemiology, I got taught that with observational data, you can only find associations, but not really proving cause and effect. And I think that we have moved away from this over the last decade or so, more specifically, to really allowing us to say, well, actually, we can use what we call observational data. So pretty much like if you have the exact same study question and study this in the same target population with the same eligibility criteria of participants, you will find very similar findings in a randomized controlled trial or in an observational setting. So I think that has been proven in the recent years with study results as well as conceptual work. And so this has convinced the journals now to encourage researchers to think causally, even in an observational setting. And hopefully also we are in the future allowed to say what we are doing if we have a causal aim to actually explicitly say this. And I'm sure that Jeremy has and also some thoughts about this.
Yes, Jeremy, please.
Yeah, so when I get asked this question, I often answer by saying that, we've been doing observational or associational research for a long time. And what people usually say is like, okay, this is an observational study or an associational study. In the past, people have said, okay, this is not estimating a causal effect, but maybe it's evidence that we should do a, in quotes, causal study in the future. And so right away, to me, that's people admitting that there is some connection between what they found in their observational study and something they're interested in that's causal. So it's admitting right away that there is a connection. I think the problem is that, there are, it's hard to do an observational study, or rather, some observational studies are not believable because the assumptions are unlikely to be satisfied to an extent where it's really hard to get anything out. But really, the goal has always been to do a causal study, and I think everybody in that way admits that there's a connection to a causal study. So we've always admitted the connection there. Now we're just asking people to be clearer about the question they're asking. So you are trying to answer a causal question. Maybe your answer is not causal, maybe it's bad. That's perfect. That can happen. You can ask a question, you can get an answer that you don't believe, but still the question itself is causal. And when people admit that their question is causal, then they might be more likely to use the right methods.
I have a feeling I want to take this back to to being taught stats and taught about how to write a paper just to hold it up. Because it feels very kind of intuitive to someone who's starting out on that journey. Tobias, You mentioned there, the specific conditions about it. And Jeremy, you mentioned specific language. This has kind of come together in this Target Trial Emulation framework a little bit. So perhaps you could explain what that is.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing framework. So in epidemiology, we used certain aspects of avoiding systematic biases, systematic errors in designing and analyzing observational studies, and there was now a tendency to bring this together, and formally it has been formulated 10 years ago or 12 years ago. So in this target trial framework, target trial emulation, so pretty much what we are aiming to do is to come up with a hypothetical protocol to run a randomized controlled trial in an observational setting. So we write up a protocol as if we would run a hypothetical trial, then using observational data to emulate it. So it sounds almost too good to be true, but by doing so, by defining clearly who should be in your study, so the so-called eligibility criteria, exclusion criteria, by clearly defining what is the intervention or what is the exposure precisely, how is the intervention being given once and then you take it forever, or you take it for a week, or and so on, and define what you're trying to estimate, and then finding the data to allow you doing this, emulating this, starting the treatment for those in the intervention group to those in the reference group at the same time to avoid certain biases, have the same length of follow-up, have the same length of outcome definitions. So really having a protocol that is necessary for running randomized controlled trial, applying this to an observational setting, and using hopefully the best data available to run it. And obviously, we are not assigning the intervention at random. We cannot do this, but with certain analytic techniques and enough information to avoid or to reduce the amount of what we call confounding, will allow to get us very close to the effect that we would have seen if we could have conducted a randomized controlled trial. So that's the target trial framework in a nutshell.
And you say very close. Are there lots of caveats around that?
Well, there are papers now that compare the result of an existing randomized controlled trial with observational settings. And sometimes they're close, sometimes they're exact, sometimes they're overestimating, sometimes they're underestimating. Because the data that you have available have certain issues, certainly, and you need to understand them. The question is, if you don't have a result of a randomized controlled trial, but you run a target trial framework, a target trial emulation, is that giving you the effect that you're after? There is some evidence that this is actually true. So there are randomized controlled trials that are confirming the observational target trial data, but there's no guarantee, obviously, that you can have to say, like, this is the effect that I'm after.
How much you believe it's causal or not comes down to, in that specific case, are the assumptions believable? Is it believable that the analytic technique, for example, that's being used can account for all of the leftover confounding or selection bias or whatever that bias may be?
Tim, what do you think?
I will add that there are attempts to try and see how close the emulations are to the actual trial when comparing the results, and I think that's the best you can do, quite honestly, is say, is the observational target trial as close as possible to a real trial? And that's typically what people use to determine whether or not they think the results should be well aligned or not. Very frequently in these papers that compare the outcomes between a target trial and an actual trial that has been performed, they find that those that emulated the trial poorly tend to have effect estimates that are deviating pretty far from the trial estimate, whereas when they're very closely emulated, they don't see that much of a deviation. But I mean, that's separate from what Jeremy was talking about, which is the assumptions underlying all of these things we do.
So, Tim, we've got very clear, I seem to think we had a clear hierarchy of evidence before, RCTs at the top, observational below. What does this do to that kind of hierarchy of evidence?
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about the hierarchy of evidence given the causal revolution that's happened even since I've been in med school, which I don't think was that long ago, but actually was almost 20 years ago. Jeez. And we were all given these little pyramids that say, at the top is, RCTs and systematic reviews of RCTs, and at the bottom is case control studies or case studies or whatever is at the bottom. But it turns out that this hierarchy is not very helpful because you can have really good observational studies that give you better answers than really poorly done RCTs. And as a research editor, I get to see the gamut, all these assumptions and all these different ways being violated because you have people turning in papers all the time that they may or may not realize they're making mistakes in. And sometimes those mistakes are fixable, and that's fine too. But I think it's important for research to move forward, for both editors to understand that this hierarchy of evidence doesn't really exist, and that you have to modify your heuristic about how you evaluate papers that are coming in and how you make judgments on what is going to help your readers, clinicians, and patients learn the most that they can from information that they have. So it's an exciting time, but it also requires a lot more investment in understanding what's going on because you have to be always vigilant. Even when you get an RCT, you can't step back and trust that everything is just perfect because it was randomized. You still have to pay attention. And I think some of the reason that hierarchy of evidence came about is because people wanted a simple heuristic. They're like, oh, RCTs or meta-analysis of RCTs, I'll just, whatever it says, I'll take that word for it. And observational studies, I'll look at it, but I won't take much stock into it. But I think we're learning that with rigorous methods and attentive research personnel and researchers, you can get very good estimates from even the most routine data.
I'm going to clip that bit out, Tim. The BMJ editor says the hierarchy of evidence is non-existent. I can imagine that causing some debate on social media.
That's what Cameron said. Direct your emails to him.
Could I add something to that?
Of course, Jeremy.
So yeah, I agree with everything Tim said. And I just wanted to say that it could be that the hierarchy of evidence, the pyramid, is true on average, that like maybe RCTs on average do better than other designs that are below it on the hierarchy. But when you need to make a decision about something, you have one study in front of you. And are you going, even if 75% of RCTs end up, being believable, you don't know if your study is part of that 75 or not. So the hierarchy of evidence becomes not very useful to you if you have one paper in front of you that you need to make a decision about. Just because it's higher up on the pyramid shouldn't mean that you should believe this paper more or less.
You mentioned earlier, Tim, the meta-analysis of RCTs. When it comes to something like a target emulation trial with apparent causation, but with some caveats around it. I mean, how does one go to putting all of this kind of data together and perhaps synthesizing something out of that?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Well, I'm not a meta-analyst, so that is not in my area of expertise. But I will say that, I think people don't, narrative reviews can help a lot, particularly if the research field is manageable in those terms. For research fields that are huge, well-done meta-analyses can definitely inform. But I think it's important to understand the assumptions that you make when you combine that data and the data that are going into these, and if they're, really comparable and really whether or not you can actually lump them into groups that can be meta-analyzed. Sometimes people do meta-analysis come hell or high water, but the groups aren't well comparable, the studies don't meld well, and so you're meta-analyzing and then the input is not great, so the output doesn't give you a whole lot of new information. And so I think I would always exercise caution when you're evaluating whether or not studies are meta-analyzable, whether or not they can be combined, whether or not the aspects that are being thrown into the meta-analysis are actually useful to get information about a group of papers. And that's where I think, narrative reviews are a lot more useful, just because sometimes it just takes somebody with, a brain to sit down and read these papers and synthesize the information and then summarize that in a way that is informative and not just regurgitating facts, so that people can help clinicians and patients read something coherent that is that can create a synthesis of this information.
Tobias, you're agreeing there.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And the other piece that's it's often forgotten, and Jeremy sort of talked in this direction already, there isn't such a thing as the effect of something. So even if you compare results of perfectly conducted randomized controlled trials being conducted in different settings, let's say in a meta-analysis, and then you show the effect, that effect isn't true for everyone, because in each setting, you may have a difference in effect, and that's true for that setting. So it's what we call heterogeneity of effects if you go across different settings. And so this is important to understand. And so also then if you're doing a target trial in different settings, you will not find the effect. You find the effect that is specific for this setting, even if everything is done perfectly. So combining the evidence in meta-analysis is a good thought, but in the end, it may also be misleading because we're showing one effect, one pooled effect, and people say, oh, that's the effect, but there isn't such a thing as the effect. So that's something what we should also keep in mind when reading these papers. And then what Tim said, like, we have to, it's always a good idea to think about these aspects and have people trying to combine the evidence with all these pieces and providing guidelines for clinicians, for policymakers, for health insurance companies, or whatever's needed to really provide the best health care, to provide the best evidence for people who treat and to prevent disease and to hopefully reduce burden of diseases.
I mean, ironically, I think what I'm taking from this is having that skeptical, view of anything you read, even the RCTs that perhaps you gave a little bit of a pass to before, applying that critical thinking there as well.
Yeah, I think the takeaway should be you can be more skeptical of the RCTs, which probably on balance do a good job, generally because it requires a ton of time and effort. So people aren't just doing this, as a side project as a resident. But also I think the takeaway should be that people should not dismiss observational research. It can give us a lot of information. It may be the only thing we have to learn about effects, because you can't always randomize things.
That's it for this episode. Cameron will be back with you in a fortnight with more medicine and science. I'm Elizabeth Mahays. Thanks for listening.